Over time, Gaza was simply being destroyed by Israel. So my assessment of the situation basically changed in the second half, or rather by the end of 2024. At some point, I sensed that the accumulated effect of what we were doing, Israel was doing in Gaza, was basically genocide in terms of the harm done to the Gazans as a group. But there is something which, yeah, once you have this kind of people in power, Netanyahu and Bezalel Smotrich, extreme far-right ministers and a prime minister, obviously you're going to have a more deadly, a crueler, a deadlier form of war. President Biden would simply stop Israel because, you can't support that, the kind of atrocities Israel was committing. And it turned out that no, Biden simply kept supporting Israel and allowed it to do what he did.
Tensions between Iran and Israel are escalating, and many of them have their eyes off what's happening in Gaza. But there are scholars who are focused on what's happening in Gaza. Many of them have come out, and top genocide experts have now come out and clearly spelled what is happening on the ground, that Israel is indeed carrying out genocide. There's some who were reluctant earlier to really call it genocide, and now are seeing it for what it is. Dr. Shmuel Lederman, one of them, who initially did not call it a genocide, but today says what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide. In this exclusive conversation that I'm going to have with Dr. Lederman, he's going to explain as to why and how there was a change of mind and thought when it comes to the ongoing situation in Gaza. Dr. Lederman, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global. There are many scholars like you who have actually come out and called what Israel is carrying out and doing in Gaza as genocide. What made you change your mind on the situation?
So I would say what changed is not so much my analysis of the dynamic that was going on, but basically my analysis of the accumulated effect of what Israel has been doing in Gaza. So I think until I guess mid 2024, it was somewhat possible not to say that what Israel is doing is genocide, but over time, Gaza was simply being destroyed by Israel. So my assessment of the situation basically changed in the second half, or rather by the end of 2024, as a result of the continued destruction of Gaza, the systematic destruction of the hospitals, the recurring blockade of Gaza, with basically forced starvation of the Gazan population, the systematic destruction of school, cultural sites. So at some point, I sensed that the accumulated effect of what we were doing, Israel was doing in Gaza, was basically genocide in terms of the harm done to the Gazans as a group.
Well, Dr. Lederman, also very difficult for scholars sitting in Israel or from Israel to really call what Israel does as genocide, because anything that you say, anything anybody says is construed as anti-Semitic. If you could just, for our viewers, for the benefit of our viewers, make the difference, differentiate what is being anti-Semitic and what is seeing things for what they are today.
Yeah, I think we need to distinguish very sharply between criticism, whatever harsh criticism of Israel, and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is about certain prejudices, stereotypes, generalization, demonization of Jews, right? And what we are seeing here, and on many other occasions in the past, is simply a critique of a sovereign state, right? Israel, which has been doing terrible crimes before the war in Gaza, right? I mean, much before the war in Gaza, we had been conducting deadly military operations in Gaza. Before that, the military occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories is a crime in itself. The settlements are a war crime. So I think it's absolutely possible to criticize Israel very harshly, as one should do, without that having to do even remotely with anti-Semitism.
Have you faced such criticism after
I mean,
after
me
your
being
statements on genocide? Have you
so
also faced such criticism?
so me being an Israeli Jew, it's harder to criticize me as anti-Semite, right? So you might find on social media things like that, right? This is he's a auto anti-Semite, right? He hates himself basically, but it's more difficult to take it seriously when it's an Israeli Jew. There is a certain privilege in the sense of what kind of accusations can be mounted against you when you are an Israeli Jew. So I never took it seriously, this kind of accusations, and so far it has not been very common to call me that. But of course, I'm very aware of the way anyone who kind of crosses a certain line is being accused of being an anti-Semite. And that's, I mean, sometimes it's true, right? Anti-Semitism is a real problem, right? But very often, more often than not, it's simply, a way of silencing people, in my view, to call them anti-Semite because they criticize Israel rather in what some perceive as too harshly, right?
Conversely, the fact that you are an Israeli Jew, the fact that you have spoken for the things that have happened to Jews as well, Holocaust is a problem, is one of the worst crimes that the world has ever seen, and all that. When you say and you call Israel out, Netanyahu's government particularly out, does that add credence and credibility to the whole argument?
I think it shouldn't be the case, right? I mean, I think we should not listen to Israeli voices or Jewish voices more than we listen to Palestinian voices or other voices,
True.
right? I think we need to take those voices as they are, and actually, especially the voices of the victim, right? But it so happens, I mean, that's the reality, unfortunately, that I realize that when Israelis say that, when Jews say that, it's taken more seriously, or maybe by some people, it's taken as more authoritative. Again, I want to emphasize, I don't think it should be the case, but unfortunately, that's the case, and I'm aware of that, and it's okay. I mean, I think all of us should be committed first and foremost to stop that, right? To stop what Israel is doing, and whatever. We need to say the truth about what we are seeing is happening. But we also, and complementary to that, we need to do everything simply that we can to make it stop by pressuring, governments outside of Israel, by pressuring Israelis, by telling them what is actually being done by them and by their government.
Dr. Lederman, the fact that there has been growing consensus on this one issue. Now, I also interviewed President of the International Association for Genocide Scholars, Melanie O'Brien, and she said that there's growing consensus, mostly Jews, as also other scholars from across the world have come together calling this a genocide. Reluctance on some of the scholars who are based out of Israel, and there are some exceptions, you included. But is there growing consensus amongst genocide scholars that this is maybe one of the most horrific crimes that we are seeing against humanity?
So that's my sense too, that there is quite a consensus among genocide scholars about this question. Now, it's very hard to assess that, in any kind of certainty, because after all, there are many different genocide scholars, and some are more involved in the situation and speak about it and write about it, and some are less. But to the extent that one can assess that, that's my sense as well, that, basically almost any genocide scholar that I saw or I heard said, well, at that point, I think it's genocide. And that has been roughly the case, I would say, since the second half of 2024. Now, I do need to clarify that there are actually two different discourses going on here, because when genocide scholars speak, I mean, usually and naturally, When people speak about genocide, they think in the legal terms, right? There is a genocide convention, a UN genocide
Yes.
convention that defines the term genocide, and it's a specific legal definition. And that's one discourse that many are engaged in, whether it rises to the very high bar, it should be said, of the legal definition of genocide. But genocide scholars, for a long time, for decades, have been engaged in a discourse that is critical of the legal definition because it's a very narrow definition, and because it's originated partly in the political interest of the states that formulated it. So we've been critical of this definition. So I would say, I think at this point, probably for the majority of genocide scholars, when they say this is genocide, they also think in terms of the legal definition, but
Right.
also more broadly. For others, I would say, and in certain senses, including myself, we feel less committed to the legal definition and more to broader definitions that we have in mind. And first and foremost to the reality we're seeing in front of our eyes, which is basically in Gaza, the Gaza society is being destroyed by Israel. I mean, there is no way around it. I think that's clear to anyone who has conscience and clear eyes to see what is going on.
See, that's where Dr. O'Brien kept focusing on the legality and the legal aspect of genocide. So you make a very important point. Could I ask you broadly, what is the criticism in boxing it in the legal terms of genocide, and how it does not work for many countries and many places where genocide actually must be being carried out and not be defined as genocide?
Right. So the legal definition of genocide basically has two components. The most important component is the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, especially national, ethnic, religious, and racial groups. So there is you need to prove an intent to destroy the group as such. And then there are genocidal acts, killing, creating conditions of life that are aimed to lead to the death of members of the groups, and so on and so forth, several genocidal acts. Now, if we start even with the question of intent, right? First of all, very, very often it's very hard to prove an intent. I mean, intent here means you need to show that in the mind of the decision makers, they want that's their aim, to destroy the group, right? Or that's their intent. There might be also other intents, but one of their intents at least is to destroy the groups as such, or a substantial part of it. That's very hard to prove. Now, and it should be said, in history, quite often genocide took place, or what I would define and many others would define as genocide, namely the destruction of a group or causing a very severe harm to the group as such. Quite often in history, it was done without a clear subjective intent to destroy the group, but rather there was a policy whose foreseeable consequence was the destruction of the group, whether through killing or expulsion or putting them in concentration camps or many different means. But there wasn't necessarily an intent to destroy the group. It was simply the foreseeable consequence of policy. And for many of us, once you have this kind of a destruction of a group, it should be called genocide, right?
The
Regardless of the
ambiguity of
subjective
intent,
intent.
basically. The
Yeah,
ambiguity of intent.
right, absolutely, and that was intentional. So when I said before that, the part of the or part of the reason the legal definition is as it is because of the political interest of the states that were involved in its formulation. So intent was, for example, partly one way to distinguish between what the Allies did and what the Nazis did, right? The Allies killed hundreds of thousands of people, right, in the bombings, nuclear bombings of Japan, or incinerating entire cities in Germany, or what Britain did in India, for that matter, right? But not out of an intent to destroy the group. The Nazis obviously did have intent to destroy many different groups. So the emphasis on intent was one way to distinguish between what the Allies did and what the Nazis did. And there are other aspects there. So, for example, the issue of cultural genocide. For Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish Polish jurist who coined the term genocide,
Yes.
The destruction of a group's culture, its cultural institutions, sites, its institutions of education, so on, its use of the language. That was a prominent way of destroying a group. And he wanted this part of cultural destruction to be in the definition, but that was removed partly because different states were worried that they would be accused of genocide. For example,
Very
again,
interesting.
what Britain did in India, what the US did to the Native Americans or to the African Americans, what the
But the
French did in
Australians,
Algeria, and so on and so forth. So political interests were part of it, and this is
yeah,
one reason. So in other words, it was intentional that the legal definition would be so narrow that very often you would be able to determine genocide only in retrospect. Paradoxically, we have a situation where the legal definition or the convention actually serves to block us from preventing genocide when they actually take place, like in the case, for example, in the case of Israel and Gaza, right? Because on the one hand, we are seeing the destruction of Gaza and Gazan society. On the other hand, there's still a debate whether there is an intent to destroy the group or not, and it's going to be determined by the ICJ, the International Court at The Hague, Court of Justice at The Hague. Only, probably, and it will take them several years. In the meantime, nobody stops Israel, and that's a problem. And it's a problem that is inherent to the very high bar of the legal definition of genocide.
right. Dr. Lederman, you interact very closely with students, the youth of Israel. Now, in the recent past, we've seen some videos that have come of young children, not just teenagers, very young children, making videos, pranking their parents about sending aid to Gaza, and then laughing about it. In your assessment, how are children really absorbing the actions of Israel against the people of Gaza? Are they absolutely removed from reality in terms of how and what they're being told is happening in Gaza? Is the reason why they can or are making fun of humanitarian aid going or not going to Gaza?
You mean in Israel, right?
In
Children
Israel,
and
yes.
youngsters in Israel.
Videos of children, very young kids. I mean,
Yeah.
they're not even university students.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is the dehumanization. I would say two main things, right? The dehumanization and demonization of Palestinians have been ongoing for a long time in Israel, right? And especially when it comes to Gaza. Gaza is like, has been for Israelis, including young children, they definitely absorb that, right? Had been kind of a black hole. We don't know what's going on there, and we're perfectly fine with putting them under a blockade and again engaging in kind of deadly operations, killing hundreds and more, and actually thousands of people every time. So that has been going on for a long time. And of course, children, young people, they absorb that. To that, it should be added the absolute trauma of the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, Hamas and other Palestinian factions. I mean, there's no way to underestimate the impact it had on Israeli society. So, as I said, on the one hand, we already had all kinds of, stereotype, dehumanization, total disregard for Palestinian lives beforehand. But that put all of that on steroids. So that escalated the attitudes towards Palestinians as people who don't, I mean, of course, there are different opinions in Israel, but it's not surprising that many young people, whether because they experience themselves the trauma of October 7th, or because they absorbed beforehand the dehumanization of Palestinians and especially Gazans, or because over time they also were influenced by many of the politicians and much of the mainstream media in Israel, which had also been engaged in a total dehumanization of Palestinian lives. So it's not surprising that many of them would be perfectly okay or would be mocking the suffering in Gaza. For them, yeah, for many of them, not all of them, right? For many of them, it's almost a form of entertainment, revenge, an expression of the very little regard they put on Palestinian lives, and even worse than that, right? They kind of
Is it worrying?
celebrate the stuff.
Is it
What's that?
worrying though? Is it worrying that instead of looking at a future where there should have been a solution to the Israel-Palestine question, we are now looking at maybe an entire generation, a new generation of children on both sides who are hating each other rather than even considering even that iota of consideration for a solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, even before that, I think there was a sense in which, I mean, we need to remember both. I mean, if we think about the current generation of young people in whether in Palestine or in Israel, they were brought up against a background of the Second Intifada, I mean, starting from the early 2000, huge suppression of the Palestinians, huge extreme violence against Palestinians, and also suicide attacks in Israel and other kind of Palestinian violence in Israel. And that was the beginning. And then there was Hamas takeover of Gaza in 2006 and 7 in a kind of gradual process. And then for Israelis, the experience was we give, and that was after the so-called Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip. The Israeli narrative is we gave them back Gaza and we got back in return rockets and missiles and so on from Hamas. For the Palestinians, is that Hamas won a democratic election and then Israel placed a blockade on it, and since then Israel has been mowing the lawn, as Israelis call it. I mean, again, committing terrible atrocities in Gaza. So we're talking about a generation of young people. I mean, I'm talking about people who are now 16, 17, 20, right? The people who fight in the army, in both armies right now, right? There is no symmetry, but I mean, we're talking about people who brought up on basically a situation where there is only extreme violence between the different sides. Of course, again, to emphasize, there's no symmetry, right? The occupier, the occupied, and so on. But the experience of people is violence and total lack of familiarity with the other, and much more than that, a total dehumanization of the other, right? And then you have what we have now, right? October 7th, the war in Gaza, and the genocide in Gaza. And obviously, we're going to have a generation of young people who are younger or children now and young people, and they're going to, and they hate, of course, they hate the other side. And they don't think there is any way other than violence to deal with the other side. And that's going to, of course, it's terrible in itself. It's going to probably encourage more violence between the sides. And it's going to make the prospects for any kind of political settlement much less likely. So, yeah, the situation is grim in so many ways.
Dr. Lederman,
right.
to put it on record, what you're seeing with the Palestinians, and not just Gaza, West Bank as well, would you consider the actions of Israel as genocide only after October 7th, or was there a lead up? And nobody's condoning what happened on the 7th of October. It was dastardly, it was horrific, and Israel had to respond. But what before the 7th of October? What was the situation of Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza before the 7th of October? How would you define that period?
So I would say before October 7, one could definitely speak about, one could definitely talk about multiple war crimes against humanity that Israel has been committing against the Palestinians, right? I think the occupation itself is a terrible crime. And of course, the deadly military intervention in Gaza. And many other, I mean, there were and there have been daily war crimes that, and simply crimes in the moral sense, not just in the legal sense, right? That Israel has been committing against the Palestinians. But if you ask me about genocide, I do think that genocide is a kind of, it's not necessarily the crime of crimes, but yeah, it is a higher bar. And I think that that it's more appropriate to talk about genocide only after October 7, right? But on the other hand, I would say, when you realize that genocide is about harming a group and basically an attack on a group, I would say from my perspective, the genocide is happening, the genocide that Israel is committing in Gaza is happening not just, or the genocide that Israel is committing against the Palestinians is happening not just in Gaza right now. I mean, of course, the most extreme genocidal acts are in Gaza against the Gaza. But once you have a situation of genocide, once you have a context of genocide, other kinds of crimes that in themselves might not have been genocidal are becoming, from my perspective, part of the genocide. So what Israel has been doing in the West Bank since October 7 or over a long time now, it's for me, it's part of the genocide. It's part of what has become a genocidal attack against the Palestinians. And in a certain sense, even the kind of silencing of Israeli Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, right, within the 48 borders, right, the kind of silencing that that Israel is committing against them, their kind of suppression of their voices, because they are taking a risk every time they open their mouth to even express sympathy with what is happening to their people in Gaza, right? And for me, it's part of the genocidal attack against the Palestinian people, because eventually the victim group is the Palestinian people. The Gazans are a substantial part of this group. But just imagine if after October 7, Israeli Jews or Jews in general, they would not be able to talk about what was done to their own people, right? To their friends, to their families. I mean, can you even imagine such situation? And if it did happen, if it had happened, wouldn't we say that that's part of the general attack on Israeli Jews as a group, right? The silencing of them, the suppression of their voices, of their grievances. So I would say, yeah, before October 7, we saw multiple crimes, but not genocide. So genocide, again, is a more extreme kind of crime. But since October 7, we are seeing a kind of genocidal attack on the Palestinians as a group, not just in Gaza, but also in other spaces where Israel is controlling the Palestinians.
Dr. Lederman, another very important distinction that has to be made, because a lot of people are boxing Israel as one whole group that is thinking in a particular way, and that is annihilation of Palestine and Palestinians. Not everyone in Israel is thinking like that. In fact, there have been protests within Israel questioning the government. So the distinction that has to be made over here, and I'd ask you this: how much of all this that you're seeing today has to do and is to be blamed on the extreme Netanyahu administration, with the support from people like Ben Gvir, rather than the moderates that you saw in the past? In fact, there are politicians who are also coming out and have been highly critical of Netanyahu's actions. So how much of this that you see today, the Israeli action, has to do with Netanyahu and his allies?
Yeah, so I would say my answer would be a bit complex, because I would say, on the one hand, I don't think we should. So, for example, you mentioned the kind of criticism that Netanyahu has received from other Israeli politicians. But should be said, in the vast majority of cases, this kind of criticism was not about the policy in Gaza. It was about the question of the hostages. It was about the need, for example, to offer an alternative to Hamas in Gaza in the form of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, to bring them in. Right? It was not a moral criticism about what we've been doing to Gaza and so on, or to the Palestinians. So, in that sense, I would say we shouldn't think about who is doing what we are doing, what Israel is doing in Gaza, only in terms of Netanyahu and the government. It's much of the society is either participating in it actively by serving in the army, or by supporting, or by giving it legitimacy and so on. That's on the one, right? On the other hand, yes, we do have the Netanyahu government is the most far-right extremist government that Israel has ever had. If a different government would have led this war, it might have been different. I mean, there would still be many atrocities that Israel would have committed. That's I think pretty certain. But we might have not seen a total blockade of Gaza, a total forced starvation of Gaza, this amount of mass killing in Gaza, a massacre every day. We might have not seen that. Who knows, right? We can't say. But there is a sense in which, yeah, once you have this kind of people in power, Netanyahu and Bezalel Smotrich, extreme far-right ministers and a prime minister. Obviously, we're going to have a more deadly, a crueler, a deadlier form of war. So that would be my answer on the one hand, not to kind of, in many sense, the majority of the Israeli society is complicit in it, is participating, is supporting. On the other hand, yeah, there is a difference, even today, there is a difference between the kind of policy that the far-right ministers and Netanyahu himself are trying to push for and to lead to, and the kind of policy that certain, people in the army want to see, or other politicians want to see, and other sectors of the society want to see. So it's kind of a nuanced analysis, I would say. That's it.
Dr. Lederman, I'd have to admit that I've been rather diplomatic, but you've been brutally honest about how the Israeli society has been viewing this. Thank you so much for being that honest. But before I let you go, the Genocide Convention, there are cases against Netanyahu at the ICJ. Where do you see this entire case headed? Where do you see, and do you see a solution at all coming out of this entire crisis that faces Israel and Palestine today, apart from the fact that, the Israeli administration has also now decided to take on Iran?
Yeah, so I would say, here again, we have different forces playing out, I think, and who knows what's going to be the result. So on the one hand, I think we have been seeing unprecedented pressure in terms of international public opinion to hold Israel to account, to stop what Israel is doing, to bring, the people responsible to justice. And over time, it's also been increasingly difficult to say that Israel is not committing genocide or crimes against humanity or terrible crimes and should be stopped. On the other hand, Israel, first of all, had its allies, right? First and foremost, the US, and but also many of the European states, right? And not just European states, right? The Modi government in India, right? So Israel has many allies, and especially the U.S. As long as the U.S. supports Israel, we'll probably see a very limited response in terms of the international community and what it does. And also we do have the problem, again going back to the very high bar of the legal definition. I'm not sure at all that the ICJ would rule genocide against Israel. I mean, if to judge by the legacy of the ICJ and the international courts that have dealt with the question of genocide in different cases, because of the high bar, it's quite likely that the ICJ would come to the conclusion that there is no proof that Israel intended to destroy the Palestinians and the group. There might be multiple proofs for other crimes, right, but not genocide. So it's very likely. And that would also influence, and in any case, that's in in years. Who knows when they will come to the ruling? So we have different forces at play here, and I think the most important thing to do is to apply pressure on governments that count for Israel. And right now, there is no way of influencing Trump, but European governments, we need to pressure them much more to put pressure on Israel to stop it. And to engage in mass protests, and many have been doing around the globe to try to influence further public opinion, politicians, and so on. And it should be said, Israel has been helping any of us who wants to stop that by committing more and more. I mean, that's paradoxical and it's terrible to say, but the kind of atrocities we're seeing every day are absolutely astonishing. You would expect, just in terms of national interest, that Israel would stop that or mitigate that at some point. But the fact that it doesn't shows you the kind of disconnect from reality and the kind of the way massacres of Gazans have become routine in Israel. Nothing almost to mention. Now, in terms of what we'll see in the future, again, who knows? It depends on what forces will win, right? The kind of social movements we see that are horrified by what Israel is doing, and at the very least wanting to put much more pressure on Israel to liberate the Palestinians from Israel.
Final question, sir.
Sure.
Are you disappointed in the international community, world leaders, and the ineffectiveness of the United Nations Security Council?
I mean, Yes, absolutely. And at the same time, it's not surprising, right? I mean, we have, again, as the genocide scholars, we have known for a long time that, at least when it comes to important allies of members of the Security Council, and especially the US, you're going to see immunity immunity and support for the crimes that those allies are committing. And it might be Saudi Arabia in what it did in Yemen, and it might be Israel in what it has been doing to Palestinians, right? So on the one hand, yes, of course it's disappointing, and I should be honest. One of the mistakes I made in my analysis of the war is that I thought that at some point President Biden would simply stop Israel because you can't support that the kind of atrocities Israel was committing. And it turned out that no, Biden simply kept supporting Israel and allowed it to do what it did. And of course, without U.S. support, without American support, Israel could not have done what it did. Um, so yeah, absolutely there is a disappointment. But at the same time, we need to recognize the international system has been broken in that sense for a long time. I mean, once you have uh, important allies of the great powers, they have been allowed to commit terrible crimes. And that's, we see the same situation here, only it's much more um, clear to so many people around the world who pay attention to what is going on.
On that note, Dr. Shmuel Lederman, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.